Welcome to our program, Colonel Sweet and Mark Toth.
Daniel, it's great to be back on the show. Thank you.
Good to be here, Daniel. Thanks.
US President Donald Trump will meet Russian dictator Vladimir Putin this Friday in Alaska. The Economist reported that Vladimir Putin would propose a ceasefire in the air and at sea as a part of these negotiations between the US and Russia. What is your expectation ahead of this summit between Trump and Putin, Colonel Sweet?
That's a great question. And we've seen multiple versions of what Steve Witkoff provided for talks to get Russia to the table. And we saw, I think, earlier, about 2 days ago, what Putin's response was. Basically, Putin says, ceasefire in exchange for the occupied territories. In the Witkoff version, depending upon who you listen to, there was some discussion about ceding terrain back, but there was also discussion about, the NATO or the European forces, providing weapons still to Ukraine and whether or not they'd be admitted into NATO. So I think it's a work in motion. I don't think they're going to ever get to any solid discussion points until they actually meet in Ukraine. But what we do know is that President Zelensky is pretty adamant that he is not going to be ceding any type of terrain from Ukraine back to Russia, and he's very clear that the Ukrainian constitution forbids that. So that's the starting point, I think, and I think we're already at a point where we're not going to get anywhere. So we'll see how it works out between now and Friday. And by the way, I'm not sure we even know if President Zelensky is going to be in attendance. So more to follow. It's just Monday, but a lot can happen.
And Mark, what is your take on this matter and on expected summit between Trump, Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, Daniel, I think if we zoom out, and I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but I do think this may be one of the most dangerous weeks of the war for Ukraine, not in terms of the battlefield itself, but for this competition that's going on between Putin and Trump, and each of them maybe trying to come to some kind of peace, doing so in a separate way that doesn't involve President Zelensky and Ukraine as a whole. I think what we have to be on guard about is that Putin is trying to win, and we've used this phrase quite often, including on your program, John and I, that he's trying to win in the negotiating table what he's yet to have won on the battlefields. And we need to guard against that. I think it's very important these next 4 days until Friday comes about, that President Zelensky, your government, your ambassadors, the people themselves need to be making Ukraine's case. This is not a situation where Ukraine should yield 1 centimeter of Ukrainian territory, whether that's in the Donbass, whether that's in Zaporizhia, whether that's in Kherson, or whether that's in Crimea. You don't reward an illegal invasion like this. It's in complete and utter violation of international law and in complete violation of Russia's duties as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So for me, this week is really about managing the dangers that come Friday, Ukraine could be facing and having to react to.
And Mark, from your perspective, did Putin make a concession by proposing this so-called ceasefire in the air? And if so, why did he make this concession, this offer right now? Because of high casualties, bad situation with economy, or the prospect of secondary tariffs and sanctions Donald Trump threatened to impose?
Yeah, given that this summit is coming on Friday, I think we have to be careful at looking at any so-called concession that Putin might be making at this time. And maybe for out of the sake of caution, look at it as a Trojan horse. Ask yourself what's inside of that concession, what's its purpose. It may have a military application. I tend to doubt it. I'll let John comment on that a little bit more. He understands the battlefield at this point, but based on my understanding, these 8 salients that basically are happening right now in the Donbass that are bypassing the fortress belt, that are having some success. It's creating a situation whereby there are gains. It's basically at a foot's pace, a square kilometer a day, but nonetheless gains. I'm not so sure that pressure is there yet that he needs to pause it. Therefore, I think it has more to do with the negotiating tack that Putin's trying to create in advance of this meeting to say to Trump, look, if you basically capitulate on behalf of Ukraine, give me everything that I want, I'm going to do the ceasefire in the air. So I would just view it as a Trojan horse until we know more. I'd be very, very cautious about buying into it too fast.
And Colonel Sweet, is this a concession from Vladimir Putin or a special negotiating tactic just to get everything he wants right now?
Yeah, I don't think it's a concession at all. As a matter of fact, there's ulterior motives here. Look, who wins in the presentation of no longer firing long-range weapon systems? Who benefits the most out of it? Russia does. And Russia benefits because Ukraine has been very effective in hitting their oil refineries, has been very effective in going after their gas refineries, has been exceptionally effective in going after production facilities for drones and railway stations and airfields. So if Russia can get Ukraine to stop doing that, then Russia can begin to build combat power again, can begin to build revenue again to finance their war. Okay, so it's clearly there is an intent, and you cannot take Putin's word for anything at face value. You have to look at what is he trying to get out of this. Sure, there's a ceasefire. And oh, by the way, he presents something to the president that says, I'm doing this to achieve peace, while Zelensky's not doing this and he wants to prolong the war. He's trying to influence the president also in that manner. So no, there's ulterior motives, and you have to look beyond what he says, and what he does is most important.
And if there is a ceasefire in the air, how could this influence the situation on the ground for both sides and the outcome of this war?
Okay, so it's a ceasefire in the air, it's not a ceasefire on the ground. Okay, so Russia's still going to be bombing. When I say bombing, they'll still be using their artillery to shell the Ukrainian fronts. They're still going to be massing Ukrainian soldiers to go into what Mark and I have said throughout the past 3 years, the meat grinder, human way of assault. So they're still going to be grinding down the Ukrainian defenses. They're still going to be enacting their war of attrition. And quite frankly, the Ukrainians' best response is the long-range strike, right, with drones and their own homemade ballistic missiles. So by taking that capability away from Ukraine, you actually give yourself an advantage to some of this. Now, look, the Ukrainian civilians that are in those target areas are going to benefit from it. But at the end of the day, it just enables Ukraine to build combat power, Russia to build combat power, and then eventually turn that back on at a time and place of their choosing. Okay, again, as Zelensky told the president and the vice president in the White House not too long ago, how many deals has President Putin honored? And I think that's the answer right there.
And Mark, let's cover the political aspect of these negotiations between Trump and Putin. Do you expect President Zelensky to receive also an invitation to participate in this meeting between Trump and Putin, or to at least meet President Trump?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it, right now? Initially, it looked like that was going to be a requirement for any kind of Trump-Putin summit, that Zelensky was going to have to be there. Then that was quickly disabused, even though people within the White House were telling reporters that I know firsthand that was the case, that Trump was going to hold firm to that there was definitely going to be a meeting. And then once Putin and his gang basically came out and said that's not the case, Trump backed off. Once again, he walked away from his own red line, which is just baffling. I've never seen someone at this high of a level keep negotiating against himself in public, so that was disturbing. From my standpoint, unless Ukraine has a seat at that table, nothing that gets decided is something that Ukraine should accept or yield to, unless somehow, and it's not going to happen, that it was everything that Ukraine wanted. Trump's not going to get that out of Putin. I think Putin at this point remains maximalist in his demands. He still wants to see Ukraine effectively fall back under the control of Moscow. He wants no future involvement with NATO, et cetera. He wants you to have your army completely dismantled. And then, even if this peace deal that we've heard floating about, even if Witkoff's version of it, this idea that somehow Zaporizhzhia and Kherson would be exchanged for the Donets, something that the Russians quickly came out and denied. That would leave you without the fortress belt. You know, from a military standpoint, Ukraine would be badly exposed. So at this point, I think we all wonder that, right, whether Zelensky will be there. He deserves to be there. He should be there. And if he's not there, he needs to make his voice heard loud and clear, whether he's in Ukraine or doing a quick campaign around Europe and the capitals, especially with the major NATO powers, basically saying this can't stand, because if we agree to this, if it's a bad deal, not only does Ukraine lose, but then Eastern Europe is badly exposed to future Russian aggression.
Colonel Sweet, Mark just mentioned this deal and said that this would be a bad deal. According to the Washington Post, Vladimir Putin would like Ukrainian troops to withdraw from the whole Donbas region. Ukraine has large fortifications there. How could this influence the outcome of this war if Ukraine withdraws from the Donbas? And how could this influence the defense lines of Ukraine?
Yeah, of course that's what Putin wants. Ukraine's firmly entrenched and dug in, and he wants them to pull out, because then they'd have to rebuild somewhere else. Look, the other thing that's missing, and Mark and I have talked about this offline a lot, is the United States and Ukraine signed a rare minerals deal not too long ago. And where are the preponderance of those rare minerals physically located? What does Ukraine get if they lose that rare minerals access? And what does the United States not going to get? I mean, the expectation was billions of dollars in revenue to help rebuild Ukraine and pay for weapons. If those facilities aren't available because Russia now owns them, it just puts Ukraine in a much more disadvantaged position. So no, Putin wants to weaken Ukraine to the point that he can come back at a latter date, 2-3 years from now, maybe 6 months from now, and finish the task. Okay, he doesn't want NATO soldiers in Ukraine in a defensive belt. He does not want American soldiers there. He wants all the weapon systems that are provided not to be provided. He wants to weaken them to the point that he can just waltz in at a latter date. And again, we have to be conscious of what he says he wants and what he wants and what he will do. Okay, so you have to listen to what he says. I got it, but pay attention to what he's done, not just in this war, but in previous wars that he's been associated with throughout the world. And I think the true colors will shine. But right now, it's hard because people want peace. They want to believe him, but they're going to be disappointed, I suspect.
Also, we have another breaking news right now. According to the Financial Times, Vladimir Putin is ready to withdraw troops from the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. But in case if Ukraine grants him, his army, his state, an access to these regions, to have the access to the land bridge between Crimea and the occupied territories on the east of Ukraine. Colin Sweet, what is your assessment of this Putin's thinking?
Once again, I think it comes down to this. Putin wants the president to believe he is trying to achieve peace, okay? And in doing so, he knows that Zelensky is not going to accept any conditions in which Russia retains occupied territories in Ukraine, in Crimea. So that is playing in the favor, if you will, of him, because he thinks that will alienate Zelensky from Trump once again, because Trump will be under the impression that Zelensky doesn't want peace, but Putin's doing everything he can to obtain peace. So it's a complicated web of lies and misdirection and misfortune, okay? But you have to look at what he's said and done in the past to get to the truth. And I hope that the advisors who are advising the president are able to get him to come off his instincts and deal with reality.
And Mark, what is your take on this offers from Russian dictator Vladimir Putin made just days before the summit with President Trump?
Daniel, if it's accurate, and a little bit of role reversal here, because this is something John can probably address a bit more astutely than I can. But if it's true, if the reporting's true, again, I think it's a Trojan horse. It's all about trying to get the armed forces of Ukraine to give up the fortress belt in the Donbass. And if he can do that by temporarily withdrawing from Zaporizhia and from Kherson, maybe he's willing to do that. Again, I'll believe it when I see it. I have a feeling this may be false. The Russians previously had denied this, but maybe they thought there's currency here. There's something to be gained at the negotiating table for offering this. And then they would simply come back another day, not too distant from now, and go after the rest of Ukraine. And John, in a second here, can speak better than I can. But if you lose that fortress belt, I mean, that's been your core strength of defending the country from Russian aggression coming from the east. And without being able to fight along the interior lines that's given you, you might have seen much wider and faster sweeping advances of Russian forces than you had. That fortress belt has been key. And part and parcel to that, and again, I've not seen the reporting from the Financial Times, but in the earlier reporting of this version of events, it would be in exchange for all of Donetsk, which would take away that fortress belt. And to me, that would represent a military catastrophe. John, do you have any thoughts on that? You're much better in tune to that than I am.
Absolutely. Look, let me just add exactly what you just said. Okay, you take away Ukraine's strength. Okay, one of their strengths, and that fortress belt is one strength. The other strength is their ability to strike deep that we're seeing with their own organic assets. You take away that fortress belt, you further weaken their ability to defend themselves. Okay. Now, the other question that Daniel, you asked a few minutes ago was whether or not Zelensky would have a seat at the table. To which my response is, I believe Putin doesn't want him at the table. Putin doesn't want a counter argument in the same room in front of President Trump. He wants his sole attention. And if President Zelensky is saying, but you're not considering X, Y, and Z, it does not play to Putin's favor. Putin knows how to, and the right word is manipulate the way I believe the president is thinking about this particular subject. The president says over and over and over, I just want the war to end. Okay, I got it. We all want the war to end, but it can't in a manner that brings complete capitulation of Ukraine to Moscow. And Zelensky's not going to let that happen. I don't believe European leaders are going to let that happen. It ends on terms favorable to Ukraine, and certainly giving up that defensive belt, it's not favorable terms to Ukraine in their long-term survival.
John just mentioned about the Putin's willingness to have this one-on-one with U.S. President Donald Trump. Mark, what kind of tactics Putin could apply, so-called KGB tactics, during his meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump? Do you expect any kind of informal dinners with cocktails, alcohol, and other informal stuff just to have more closer relations between Putin and Trump?
If there's one good thing about Trump is that he doesn't like alcohol, right? He's famous for not drinking alcohol whatsoever. So unless he can get him drunk on Diet Coke, that's not going to work. That said, I do think a charm offensive. I think he's got a pretty good read on what's driving Trump. He'll try to play up the Nobel Peace Prize aspect to this. But Trump should be remembering that, look, nobody's going to give him the Nobel Peace Prize. It's just not politically there. And I say that apolitically. There's just not enough people around the world that view Trump in a positive light. So that's not going to happen. So I could see that. I could see him trying to appeal to the transactional nature of Trump, saying, look, if we can get past this war, we can get on to business deals between us and the Russia and between the U.S. companies and the like, the sale of cheap oil and energy and gas and all of that to bring global oil prices down. You can see him trying to be transactional in that way. But I think it's more like buyer beware. And I think in the same time period, and it'll be interesting come Monday, a few days after this, I think for Ukrainians, if I can kind of be bold here and suggest to people fighting this war, is you cannot want peace more than what Trump I'm sorry, let me restart that. You cannot want peace more than Putin has told you that he wants war since 2014. So even if there's quote unquote a ceasefire or a quote unquote peace deal, it's going to be elusive. It's going to be fleeting. He'll come back for more. Putin wants more war than anything because he wants to take full control of it. And I think that's where Ukrainians need to be on guard this next week, is to say, look, we see through this. We're not going to allow it. Do everything possible to make sure that that's not the outcome, at least on Putin's terms. If you can get Ukraine's terms and you can get a pact to NATO membership and you can get NATO troops doing some kind of defensive belt in a peace thing that prevents the Russians from reinvading, all that would be great, right? Take it. That would be a good deal. But I just don't think that's going to happen.
Also, European allies are convening extraordinary meetings, virtual meetings this week to discuss possible red lines and a unified position ahead of this summit between Trump and Putin. Colonel Sweet, how should the unified position of Europe and Ukraine look like ahead of this meeting between Trump and Putin?
Yeah, and Mark and I have discussed this a lot too in some of our writings. Look, the NATO tends to look at this as Russia's going to be a problem in 3 to 5 years. So we need to increase our budget. We need to get more weapons. We need to fortify our borders more. We need to pay attention to all these things that are going on. To which, in my opinion, it's like, why not pay attention to it now? Why not enable Ukraine now? So you don't have to address Russia in 3 to 5 years. And I think Europe's coming around to understanding that they're going to have to do something, because waiting for the United States to do something is not a very good technique, and it has not worked up to now. The German Chancellor Merz has taken a much more aggressive stance towards Russia. Poland is obviously taking a much more aggressive stance, posturing towards Belarus and Russia. And the Baltic states certainly have invested a lot into Ukraine. So I think what we're going to see is some of the Eastern European countries being much more aggressive as far as how they're going to continue to support Ukraine, whereas the Western NATO countries, what we refer to as older NATO countries, are in the wait and let's see what the United States does before we make a decision. But France, the United Kingdom, are certainly very capable to continue supporting what's going on in Ukraine. Again, I emphasize, why wait 3 to 5 years for Russia to invade you when you can enable Ukraine to do the business now?
Thank you, Colin Sweet and Mark Toth, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank
Daniel,
you.
thanks for having us back on.